Wonderful. Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this evening's cemetery workshop that we are doing in collaboration with the North Carolina African American Heritage Commission and North Carolina Office of State Archaeology. My name is Adrienne Nearday, and I have the pleasure of serving as the Associate Director for the North Carolina African American Heritage Commission. We're very excited to have everyone here. I know evenings can kind of be a hit or miss time, so we're excited to have a full room for our presentation. We're excited because this has been a continuation of really an initiative for the African American Heritage Commission. We've seen a real need in the community for workshops and for sharing information regarding cemeteries and regarding their care. And as we have reached out to and met various folks around the state, we were very excited to be connected with the folks at the South Asheville Cemetery Association, who will be doing the bulk of our presentation today. And we feel that they have such a unique organization and a unique story to tell that will be helpful to folks from around the state, though we also have a number of folks who are joining us from around the country. So Ellen, if you want to do a quick introduction here.
Yes, hi, my name is Ellen Holmes Pearson. I'm professor of history at UNC Asheville and the president of the South Asheville Cemetery Association. I get to work with these wonderful people on a daily basis. I want to extend thanks to the North Carolina African American Heritage Commission for giving us this opportunity to talk about the community's contributions to preserving the South Asheville Cemetery. Before we get started, I do want to acknowledge that our leader and our founder, George Gibson, was hospitalized overnight last night. As you'll get to see him in just a few minutes on the video. He is 93 years old, but he's still going, and he's back at home now. He's got more lives than a cat. He's still perking, and we're hoping that he and his daughter Olivia Gibson Netz, who was going to be with us this evening on the panel, we're hoping that they're watching right now. So we extend our love and healing vibes out to Mr. Gibson. I want to start. I want to just.
Not there.
This is a webinar?
Yeah.
I want to just give you all a little bit of background. And to do that, I need to share my screen. You should be seeing a picture of the South Asheville Cemetery right now. It's located in the Kenilworth neighborhood, right behind the St. John A Baptist Church. And this cemetery has a very rich history, and I invite you to learn more about the history by going to the website. If you Google, let's see, if you Google South Asheville Cemetery Association, then it looks like, there it is. I knew that we had a slide with it on there. SouthAshevilleCemetery.net is the address that you can go to find some history on the South Asheville Cemetery Association and the cemetery itself. We'll share that website address again later on. I want to make sure that we have plenty of time to talk about community engagement in the cemetery. This is a recent long view of the cemetery in the wintertime. It hasn't always looked this good, as you're going to see in a second. You'll also, over the past 20 plus years, we've made tremendous inroads in cleaning up the cemetery. But you can see that it's the headstones are actually pretty sparse. There are about 2,000 souls buried in this cemetery, and it's 2 acres in space. But there are fewer than 100 headstones remaining in the cemetery. So although we know a lot about who was buried in the cemetery, we don't necessarily know where. In the interest of context, I do want to tell you that the cemetery was established in the mid-19th century. Asheville's African-American community members continued to bury their loved ones there until the 1940s when it was closed. I also want to just give you a little bit of context for one of the names that's going to be mentioned in the video that Adrian's going to show us in a minute. Mr. Gibson talks about a man named Mr. George Avery. Now he tells some very wonderful stories about Mr. Avery in this video that you're going to see. And Mr. Avery was an enslaved man who, I have an image of his headstone here, in the Union Army toward the end of the war. And when he returned from the war, his former enslaver, William McDowell, gave the 2 acres for the cemetery to the African-American community. And he deeded Mr. Avery a substantial acreage next to the cemetery. And for the rest of his life, Mr. Avery was the cemetery's caretaker. After Mr. Avery's death, the cemetery was very slowly overtaken by woods, kudzu, bramble, and vines. And after he retired in the 1980s, Mr. Gibson and his friend George Taylor tried to beat back the overgrowth themselves. They enlisted the help of friends and neighbors, and St. John A., the church members for St. John A., they brought together over the years some very diverse groups to help with the cemetery. We'll talk more about that after we see the video, but I just want to give you an idea of what the cemetery looked like even a decade ago. You can see on the left side of this image a depression, a grave depression. On the right side, you can make out in the lower right corner of that image on the right side a headstone that was buried in bramble. And another couple of images of what the cemetery looked like about a decade ago. And we're going to talk about it after the video. Mr. Gibson talks a little bit about the community engagement, the engagement of the community. And if I can stop sharing my screen, there we go. Okay. So we'll talk a little bit more about community engagement and how we got the cemetery looking a little bit better in a bit. I'm going to turn it back over to Adrian. After the video, I'll introduce our panelists as well.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ellen. So I will go ahead and get this video started. I believe you should be seeing it on your screen. Awesome.
I am George Gibson, age 91. 93, okay. She gave me 2 more years. I was born, raised, and taught in South Asheville. To make it clear, I was born in St. John A. Baptist Church and the cemetery. Remember the word born, because I remember when I was just a lad, I would follow my mother and father into the cemetery while there was a burial there at the cemetery. So therefore, I was born in. I began this life a long time ago, dreaming of what my great dream was, and that is to see everything well.
Good afternoon. My name is Olivia Gibson Metz. I am George's oldest daughter. I live here in Asheville, and we lived in the same community that he grew up in. I am 71 years old this year, and I have worked with him for many, many, many years while he worked in the cemetery. And I think just over the years, it has become more dear, more passionate. I don't want to say it's a task, but it's just a passionate project that I'd like to see completed as he would like to see completed. He has often talked of the cemetery, and it has been a life of being a part of our families. So as we talk today, hopefully we can share some information. We've both been members of the St. John A. Baptist Church all our lives. He says he was born there, and you can imagine I was born there also. Even in the community, the Kenilworth community, it is still a bright spot for both of us because we've been here all our lives. So we will now just talk a little bit about, we'll ask Dad, what were your fondest memories of the cemetery?
My greatest memory is being a lad, father, mother, and dad into the cemetery, and then seeing how deep the grave were. I was always concerned, how could they get out when we packed them in? But I've learned later that it's not about the dust. It is about the spirit that lives within you. And as I always say, let God lead the way. Just listen and then do what he say do. And things will come out satisfactory.
Mm-hmm. Now, when you were a youth there, you helped to bury some people as you got older. As you grew up in the community and your ties were with the church and the cemetery and all the people around, because at that time we know that South Asheville was considered the Black area of Kenilworth, and the Kenilworth area was the white area. So just give us a little idea of what it meant to you when you were a youth and you helped bury people.
As I foresaid, I've always thought about people getting up when they say getting up in that getting up morning and where we packed them in. And I wonder again, how did they get out? But after working with the church, preachers, I understand it's not the dust, it's the life that you live will speak for you. And at that particular time, I am still leaning and depending on him because I know he has and holds the future.
Okay, now when you helped to bury the people, I know at one time there in your later years, you helped dig graves with your brother-in-law. And then there was at one point earlier than that, that you used to help carry some of the bodies from the church to the cemetery when you were in school. Tell us a little bit about that.
Back when I was just a teenager, much later than I am now, but when the family did not have a casket bearer to carry the casket to the grave, the undertaker would often come to the school and ask the principal to use some of the larger boys to help carry the casket. And many, many times I was chosen. And I enjoyed it because it was something I could help somebody along the way. And that gave great respect to the ones that was going through a troublesome time.
Do you remember how many funeral homes were active at that time? Of course, I'm sure they were the Black funeral homes that you dealt with. You know who was active? Do you know any of them? Or do you remember?
I knew all the cemetery, embalmers during my time, funeral directors. There was Jane Wilson, there was Jesse Ray, House of Thompson, Allen Funeral Home. Mention Ray? Yeah, Ray.
Mhm.
And of course, McCoy Wilkins, and then Hamden Funeral Home. Those are the one I remember. And they was all concerned, and the way they buried it was great. At one time, the embalmers, the funeral directors, they always sent the family home, and then they would stay behind, and they would help backfill the grave. But it came a modern time when they began to leave up to the grave diggers to cover it. And I remember many times when the funeral director would leave, then my brother-in-law would climb down into the grave, and I would pass the top of the pine box down. Then he would move around and sit that on there and take it down.
Mm.
Then when I helped him out, one of the greatest sounds that you've never heard, the shovel of dirt that hit before it became silent, just a dead boom, boom, boom. And you wonder, and your heart was heavy, but yet it had to be done. So I've chosen that I would do what I could to make comfort.
So even at that time, you were just respectful. You were just compassionate for the people who had lived so hard, obviously during those times. A lot of them fell to sickness that doctors could not help, or even their living situations. You had the compassion even in their death or for the families. So do you remember Mr. Avery, George Avery?
Yes,
What was your relationship like with him? And can you just tell us a little bit about George Avery?
George Avery, as I remember, as a youth going to South Africa school, he had a orchard, apples, plums, grapes, cherries, right next to the school. And oftentimes we would, at recess, made a hole in the fence, and we would sneak into the orchard, and we would begin to get apples and grapes and whatnot. And oftentimes he would come out and see us, and he would holler, "What are you doing?" And we began to run. Many times he have put in the little seeds that grow on the privet hedge. You remember what that is, I hope you do. Take all the shots out and just put these little beads in there. And a lot of times when we start running to our hole to get back through, he would shoot. And you hear some kid holler, "Ow, ow," and that would scare you. But he never shot anybody's face. He would make you go. Then after school was out, had to go by his house to our different homes. He would be out there and say, "Boys," say, "What happened?" Say, "You want some apples?" "Yes, sir." "Well, why didn't you ask me?" "You want some grapes?" "Want a pear?" "Why didn't you ask me?" And many times he would take us down to the orchard. Instead of climbing to the trees, there was a lot of good apples on the ground we were walking over. But it seemed that we just wanted them out of the tree, just the evil way of doing things. But he said, "If you want something, ask me, and I'll give it to you."
And I think you've passed that down through the ages. I think that's the way your children were taught. If you want something, ask me, and I'll do my best to get it for you. So I can understand a little bit where that came from. So you had a good relationship with Mr. Avery. a good working relationship in the community. Where did he live in relation to the St. John A Church and the cemetery?
George Avery lived the first house. It's 3 there now, but it was only one. That when he was a young man, they said he used to make brick. So he built his house out of brick. And after a period of time, it began to crack. So they had to move. But before that time, he deceased, and his grandson living there then, the Houstons. Richard Houston was his adopted son. And they moved that way. So after the house being destroyed, then Mr. Houston gave to the church a plot of ground to enlarge their parking area. Therefore, he gave to all his children a plot from what McDowell had given him. It is 3 houses there now that is family related that are still living there. So therefore, we had a good relationship. And I appreciate him for teaching me that now I can help others.
When you first started going out to clean and trying to reclaim the cemetery to look better, who helped you, or how did you get started? What did you do?
This is back in when I retired. And because I would often go out to the cemetery and try to crawl through it to read the stones that I remember that was written there. For the great fight, sleep in Jesus, all the ones that people had on their stone. And after I retired, it just fell on my heart. I want to see it as I once remembered him. And so I decided after I retired, I got a pair of hand loppers, a sling, wasn't no weed eater, a sling. And I went out there and started working a few days. And after a while, George Taylor, which was a member of the church, he came by to check on the church and heard me down there chopping. And he came down and said, that's what I was doing. And he was just about retired from Lowe's Hardware. He said, yeah, we can get this done in a week's time. That's what he was saying, but we were saying a year's time. That's what we did, because when we would work, maybe 2 or 3 days a week, and then it began to rain or we had something to do, go back the next day, it's just like you work a garden. The place we had cleaned had overgrown more than what was there. But we never quit. Seeking that will, we asked others to help. They came in. I never forget that the AmeriCorps was one of the first who came to us. And they went out there and worked like Trojan. But then after their time, then we was almost ready to fall back in limbo. But God, through his great providence, led others from the Kenworth Association along, which we was a member of. And they began to put things in place, knew what to do, where to go, and how to get it done. Now, I have seen new seeds planted, and I've seen many come by and water it. It's began to look more like I once remembered it.
What other kind of groups or businesses?
I'm afraid to remember, to name group, because I don't want to leave you out. But I say the whole North Carolina has been a part of the restoring of the cemetery. Because if I start calling them, I'm going to miss somebody, And I don't want to miss them, but because I thank them for what they're doing and what they have done.
It has been a great work, and you certainly have had a lot of help. Even back when you got started, you said there were folks like Mr. Hunter Watson,
Right.
Mr.
Forrest
Forrest Hardy.
Yeah.
These were older men of the South
Community.
Asheville community that came out to help when you and George Taylor first started.
That's along with Johnny Baxter. I mean, it was a lot of people.
Right, that's right. And we will get in trouble if we do start calling
Yeah, well,
names.
if I call them, I don't want
But
to
we do know that there were Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts and the
Schools.
universities,
Schools.
UNCA particularly, and Western Carolina particularly, who are still partners with the South Asheville Cemetery Association, because it's not just been a labor of cleaning the cemetery, but we have evolved into a educational tool, into a cultural asset to the community. And teachers have come in, and there have been programs put in place in schools that the young people have enjoyed working on and researching. So it has evolved from when you first went out to crawling through the thicket and the thistle and being tangled to where we are now.
If I may inject, that's why I say I'd not start calling names, because Warren Wilson College, which is now in full swing with us, volunteered their time. Jeff Key and David Moore, he's an archaeologist. He's the one that's out there seeking and have found many graves. I know for myself that many graves they never would unearth, because I know where they are. Because I know when the church bought the school cemetery, the school cemetery bought property from the city, they just pushed the dirt over so far in order to make their parking lot, because it's on a hill. And I know it's at least 570 graves there that has not been unearthed. I know that's where they are, but they're probably 6 feet from the top of the grave there. So that won't be unearthed, but I know that, and I'm really hoping that everything will continue even after I'm gone.
So even now, I think we have record of maybe from 2,000 to 4,000 graves there. But you're saying there are a lot more than that.
There are a lot more, because if you notice on the if you contractors, you find on the 4 side of the cemetery, they built houses there. Some of those houses are built on graves, because it was one person that built out there. She was cleaning her backyard up, and she found ivy. She was cleaning the ivy out, and found there was tombstones on there. So she donated that back to the cemetery, which I know where every grave is. I can walk there. I can't see now, but I go there and I can tell you just about where every grave was. Back in 1984, I think that when Dr. Nayland decided to buy the Dunn's property, which my daddy worked on, and we lived on the property. He came out there and he wanted to build a high rise on Bocatcha Mountain. But the Kenilworth, along with South Asheville, disagreed, so they wouldn't approve him for this big housing project. They did recognize it as a residential problem, which if you go through now, you see a lot of houses built from St. John A all the way up to where the Dunn's main house was.
So I understand too that there's a special area that you're really compassionate about, the area where the babies were born. And there was a epidemic or something at the time. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
I heard about that. I don't remember, but I heard about the flu epidemic. It's just like the epidemic we have it now, that they have at least 4 or 5 funerals a day because they had no cure for it. So therefore, they had a section for the babies. And in doing that, Mr. Houston, he was familiar with it too. So Dr. Dillon got a permission from the city to go out and check this. When they dug down about 2 feet, the little casket, the wood casket started coming up along with bones and clothing. Therefore, all he did was just dug that up and put it back over simply on top of somebody. But nevertheless, he's the one that actually tried to destroy the cemetery.
Well, I believe the cemetery is in a much better condition just from you starting there and folks coming along to help. What are some of your favorite memories of the work days that we've had there?
As I said, I won't start calling her name, but the work days we had, they had volunteers. Some would, if they couldn't come, they would send refreshments, drinks, donuts, sandwiches, and whatnot. From South Africa to Kenilworth, which I just say Kenilworth, because we all connected. So that's where we are. So I began to see it as I once seen it as a youth, that you could walk through it and visualize the lives that were lived. To me, I have no family buried there. All buried there. My dad died in 1938. And therefore, I have nothing but friends, neighbors that I know. As of now, and that I never know. Any of my family member being buried there, just concerned about life in its entirety.
At this point, are you satisfied and are you happy at what's going on there at the cemetery? How do you feel about all that the help that you've gotten?
At this stage of life, I'm unable to work there. But I think all those that came along to just lend a hand and say that I love you, I'm concerned for your problem, your problem, and your dream will come true.
Welcome back. Thank you all for listening to that portion of the presentation. Certainly a wonderful grounding for our conversations this evening.
Yeah, thank you very much, Adrienne, for editing that video. It was very powerful. So Mr. Gibson talked a lot about the folks who've been working in the cemetery over the many years that he's been involved. You've seen some images from a decade ago. I want to, with a lot of pride, I would like to introduce some of the folks who've been working for quite some time in the cemetery. These are members of the South Asheville Cemetery Association family. They're members of, they've just been real soldiers for us, and they agreed to be with us today. First, I'd like to introduce Patricia Griffin, who is with us on Zoom. She is a retired educator. She's a former member of the Asheville City Schools Board of Education and secretary of the South Asheville Cemetery Association. And she graciously offered to fill in for Olivia Gibson Metz this evening. So Pat, thank you for agreeing to be here on such short notice. And then On the other end of the table is Dwayne Barton. He is founder and CEO of Hood Huggers International. He's a native of Asheville. He's a Gulf War veteran. Local artist with national recognition, Dwayne has served on the North Carolina Arts Council Board and is a Robert Woods Johnson Cultural Health Leader. Dwayne co-founded the Burton Street Peace Gardens and Green Opportunities. And then immediately to my left is Trey Tangle, who's a native of the Kenilworth neighborhood of Asheville, graduate of UNC Asheville, who, after living in Charlotte, returned to Kenilworth in 1980. And he and his wife, Carolyn, got involved in the South Asheville Cemetery through the Kenilworth Residents Association and the Kenilworth Presbyterian Church in the late 1980s, when they were asked to help Mr. Gibson do a wee bit of weed pulling and some trimming. And as I joke, he's been in the weeds ever since, and the rest really is, I guess, history. I'd like to start off the questions with Pat and Trey, because you all have been involved in the cemetery for a very long time. And the efforts, as Mr. Gibson said, their efforts, Mr. Gibson and Mr. Taylor's efforts to recover the cemetery got off the ground in the 1980s. And I'm just, I think I'll ask Pat first, so that since she's up there to sort of draw her back into the room. How and when did you become involved in efforts to preserve the South Asheville Cemetery?
Well, good evening, everyone. I got involved with the Cemetery Association through Eula Shaw. You and I both work in the school system, and we're sorority sisters. And so she asked me to come and be involved. And that's how I got involved with the association. And that was in 2000, and the late 1999 and the 2000 year.
And so can you tell us a little bit about, so you were involved through the school association. What sorts of groups did you bring into the cemetery, or what sorts of groups did you see working in the cemetery and involved in cemetery activities? What kinds of contributions did they make?
Well, when I first got involved with the association, the AmeriCorps was the first group that I remember that was working in the cemetery. And of course, we tried to bring in school groups. I was still with the school system at that time, and we had started adopting a plot. And so some of the students at my school, we came out, we brought some students out, and they couldn't do much because you needed heavy equipment. But we brought several groups out to work in the cemetery, and we just pulled weeds and did just little small things like that. But we also had the YMCA group there, and we had several youth groups that came out. We had scout troops that came out. And how we got these groups, there were many more groups, but how we got them was through word of mouth. And we also had a day where we were recruiting people as members. At that time, we had membership. And so with Eula Shaw and David Quinn at that time, we were inviting groups to come and join the association. So we had a big day where we invited about 75 people to come out and join us in the association. And so from there, we had one day where we had let's see what it was. it was a cleanup day that we had groups to come out. And we also had a day where I think it was Memorial Day that we had a big group out. The community came out and we did a presentation at that time about the association and inviting people to come out and help as they could. And so we had Carolina Day that came out several times. We had Asheville School to come out. We had UNCA, the city of Asheville. So we tried to recruit groups by word of mouth or either inviting them out. And it always helped if we had refreshments. And, you know, we've had refreshments for groups. We've moved from light refreshments to really Ellen's chili, her famous chili. So we have brought groups in because we feed them when they come out. We just don't want groups to come out and volunteer, but we want to show our appreciation by giving them nice refreshments.
Thanks, Pat. Yeah, Pat's volume is a little low. We're doing the best we can. So as Angela said in the chat, thank you for listening intently. Trey is immediately to my left, and the volume's a little bit better in here. And so I want to, you had said that you and Carolyn got involved through the neighborhood and through your church. Tell us a little bit about how that happened and what the cemetery looked like the first time you set eyes on it.
Well, the first time I set eyes on it, I was probably 12, 13 years old.
Oh,
I mean,
yeah.
we lived in Kenilworth, but our home, the parents' home, was a half a mile as the crow flies to the cemetery itself. So as a kid, we would walk by the cemetery on an old logging road off of Kenilworth Road up to the top of Bowcatcher Mountain to whatever kids do, but that's what we did. So I knew it was there. And the other thing is Kenilworth itself is sort of surrounds the old South Asheville community. So as a kid, I knew lots of folks in that area. I mean, it's Tessie and Albert or Dude Avery, George Taylor, who Mr. Gibson mentioned, and Sybil, his wife. We knew however many, the Dee Williams and her family, the Quicks, Johnny Rhodes and his family, the Mucklebeans, the family. I went to school with Jocelyn. I went to school with Dee. And of course, I knew the Gibsons. Olivia was in school with me, in high school with me. So my dad also grew up right next to South Asheville Cemetery. So he, as a kid, would play with the kids from South Asheville. So there was a connection there. So we knew each other. So as an adult, probably when we moved back in 1980 from Charlotte, by 85, my wife, our minister at Kenilworth Presbyterian Church, John David Stewart, and Gus Young were officers in the Kenilworth Association, the Resident Association. And they began to deal with a developer that Mr. Gibson mentioned in his video, who was wanting to change that logging road into a wide avenue into his property toward the top of Bowcatcher Mountain. And that is where the Kenilworth Resident Association and the church with its parishioners got involved with trying to talk to city council, meeting with council people one-on-one, going to planning and zoning meetings to keep that developer from encroaching on the cemetery. So there was an involvement there. And moving on, we worshiped at Kenilworth Presbyterian Church. John David Stewart, again, was the minister. Kenilworth Church, Kenilworth Presbyterian, had a long history with South Asheville. That church back probably in the 30s and 40s would have vacation, what they call now Vacation Bible School for kids from St. John A. Baptist and St. Mark's, which used to be in the South Asheville community, to come to Kenilworth Church. And, that is part of what has, I guess, that community involvement, the connections there has led to the neighborhood, if you want to call it the white neighborhood, being involved with our Black neighbors and bringing back that cemetery to life. I can recall that my first involvement was when John David Stewart stood in the pulpit, and John David was an officer in the Kenilworth Residents Association, said that we were looking for a few volunteers to do a little weed pulling and a little weed trimming of weeds. And when we got down there, that's next Saturday, it was just, you couldn't see the cemetery. There were vines to the top of trees. And I'm saying, uh-oh, what did I get involved in here? It's really overgrown. But we got on our knees, which was very appropriate, with the minister and George Gibson and George Taylor. And we started cutting and rolling ivy from the parking lot behind St. John A. Baptist down into the cemetery. So that was my first real taste of hard labor in that cemetery. As I was telling Ellen a minute ago before we went live, it's my old maid aunt would take me to old cemeteries where our relatives were born up in Abingdon, Virginia. And I got a taste for the importance of honoring those that came before us as a kid. I was probably 10 or 11 or 12. And I can specifically remember going to Sinking Springs Presbyterian Church in Abingdon and looking at the gravestone of a relative that had passed away in 1805. And, it just sort of shook me. And even as a kid, that what an honor it is to sit here and look at him. And I realized that, I stood on the shoulders of him who came before me to be what I am today. So sort of a monumental thought for a little kid, but that is quite true. And I've gone to see family down in New Bern. My great-grandparents, I found their graves down in the city cemetery there. Same feeling. So part of the reason I work on this cemetery is because I want to give that experience, even if folks don't really know, because there's not that many named tombstones. But if they know they've got family there, they can at least approach the cemetery, stand at it, and know that this is family. This is where I came from. So it's important to me to maybe try to provide that little bit of something to those folks.
Thanks, Trey.
Ellen, I don't
Yes.
know whether you can hear much of what I said before, but I grew up in St. John A. Church. And, nothing was said about the cemetery during the time. I left in 1959. But, I don't think we knew anything really about the cemetery being there. Nobody talked about it. But I learned about it, in later years, in my adult years, that the cemetery was there.
Interesting. Yeah. Dwayne, you're a relative newcomer to this group, and I'd like to hear more about how you got involved, because you were our secret, you were sort of a secret doer for us for a long time. We would go to check on the cemetery in the middle of the summer when we knew it would be overgrown, and it wasn't overgrown. And we weren't real sure how that happened for a while. And then all of a sudden we found out who had been doing this or who had been helping to do this. And so what motivated you to get started to helping to take care of the cemetery?
We started this organization around 2008 called Green Opportunities. And the goal was to get youth, and particularly youth who were, not going in the right direction, to teach them on how to invest back into their community, but really focusing on the environment as as the focus. So at that time, we was looking around the city for spaces that needed an extra hand so we can teach service. Yes, at that time we was training them and we was paying them for the training, but we also wanted them to be a part of service. I think that's the first time I came to the cemetery, and since that time, I'm learning the history and understanding all the challenges that the African American community had to face during that time. I really felt, cemeteries, particularly African American cemeteries, are sacred places. They're supposed to be taken care of. And why, if you go to most cities, they're not taken care of. So I was just locked in on that. And part of the reason I'm here in Asheville is because a lot of people in my family was dying, and my mom was telling me to come back home. So when I came back, I was going to the cemetery, particularly out in Bower Hill, and I was like, and coming to check on my dad, my favorite auntie, and said, wow, this place needs to look like a golf course. And so I was just been always committed to that, and trying to give back to those places, and always taking young people with me, because I think we have to train the next generation in understanding the value of places, especially places like that. So we felt that we would do it no matter what cost or what time. We would go out there and do what we could, man. We all know what a tremendous task that is in the Southside Cemetery, as far as the tree branches, the weed eating. I mean, it was pretty intense. I think I remember the first time we went out there with the Go training team. We put in a couple day hard days work out there, just try to do what we can. So it wasn't. So it's just a commitment from us. I mean, we call Hood Huggers International for a reason. So we want to, make sure that we giving back to these spaces and places.
That's awesome. Thank you. Let's see, Adrian, we've got maybe 8-ish minutes or so left. Okay, so I'd like to know, Pat, I thought that was a really interesting reflection that you had, Pat, that you spent you grew up in St. John A and didn't know anything about it. And that connects so well with didn't know anything about the cemetery. And that connects so well with what Dwayne was saying about making sure that the young people know and respect. And Mr. Gibson knew and had so much respect for the people who were being buried there that he helped to bury them. It's just a really kind of interesting connection that we can make about this sort of ebb and flow of making certain that we're aware of our ancestors and the people who contributed to this community, and we're respecting them and taking care of them. And we know that the people who are watching right now have either had experience in trying to do the same thing or would like to get some experience in doing the same thing we're trying to do with South Asheville Cemetery. We've done it quite well, bringing community members together from colleges, being active in local government to try to help. And we'll be talking about the future in just a few minutes. But I'm wondering if you all have any advice for people who are watching us and want to get the rest of the community involved in taking care of these cemeteries and educating people about them. What would you tell them to do? Who would you tell them to go and ask for help?
For me, I can remember a time when we had a family reunion here in Asheville, and part of family reunion was to go back to the cemetery and let's go do a work day. I think everybody, whenever some young people said, Mrs. DeWay, I'm trying to make some money. Okay, let's go out to the cemetery. We're gonna go put it work. I think every way possible, your community association, your family, the youth in your neighborhood. I think a lot of organizations, and they was all mentioned today. The thing I would like to see that we do like a year calendar, a yearly calendar, and we plug in the group so that there's always somebody taking care of space every month, committed to it a month. And the other thing, how do you monetize these places so they can be self-sustaining and you do have the resources to pay for equipment or even people to do that? I mean, that's part of what we try to do in the tours, is to make money off the tours and invest that money back into the places that we will highlight on the tour as a model. Like, you know, this is how you make money, but this is how you also give back. So I think whatever creative way you can think of to engage people and to, of course, monetize the space is what you need to do. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to experiment in all kinds of ways to make that hustle real.
Yeah. Thanks. Thank you for bringing your entrepreneurial spirit to the South Asheville Cemetery Association too. Pat, what kind of advice do you have for getting folks involved?
Well, you know, Ellen, been an educator for all my adult life. I just feel like our children are not taught our history in the schools, not like it should be taught. And so when I brought some of my students out, I wanted them to know this is part of our history that we don't really know about. So my thing is, I want to make a commitment, and I think I've said this in our meetings, that I would like to see more of our teachers, our principals to get involved, our students, get them involved in the work at the cemetery. We know the young children can't do much, but they could certainly learn the history. And I think the older, because, you know, high school students are always looking for projects. And so what a wonderful project it would be to have them to come out and study the history of the cemetery, do some work there. So I'm going to make a commitment that we get some of this done this coming school year. You know, looking at the pandemic, we don't know what we're going to be able to do, but I would like to see more of our children, our teachers, become involved in the history out here, because I live in the community, not far from the church and the cemetery. So I would like to see more of our teachers and students get involved in the history of our cemetery.
Thanks, Pat. Trey, anything you'd like to add in terms of advice for other folks?
I think with South Asheville Cemetery, a lot of things just sort of fell into place. George Gibson mentioned David Moore. David Moore, the archaeologist, works for Warren Wilson College. He lived in the neighborhood next to my parents, half a mile away from the cemetery at one time. He no longer does, but we know David Moore, and he was our neighbor. The church made a big difference. I think it helped. I think if other organizations are looking for help, go to the church. I'm not going to wave the flag for Presbyterian, but you know, we get our religion by sitting in the pews. We don't run to the altar, and you know, we get christened as kids. We just learn it sitting in the pews. So we're more open-minded, I would think. That's just my feeling as Presbyterian. And we're known to be educators, helpers. Get the church involved. If you have a church, see if you can get them involved with it, with whatever you're trying to do in whatever other cemetery you're working on. And schools are very important. I know that Warren Wilson College, UNC Asheville, Western Carolina, Asheville High School, I think we had kids from Reynolds, other high schools. Very important. And that's what Dwayne is saying. Get kids involved, teach them. It's important to teach them some history and having some hands-on experience with that history. And you get a good feeling working, you know, that's at least you're out of the classroom and you're doing something with your hands. But I think the church is important. And if there's a residents association nearby, try to tap into them and use them. Speak to your local government, whoever that happens to be, county or city, and put yourself on the docket and talk about it. That's important. But the church, I think, is what got me involved, really.
Thank you. I just want to add a couple of things, and then I'll turn it back over to Adrian for the next piece of our webinar. I think Trey actually hit on something there. A lot of what we have been able to take advantage of, we kind of bumbled into, or it fell in our laps. But some of it was intentional. I'm looking right now at David Quinn, who is watching us, and he worked so hard on proposals to get those 9 AmeriCorps teams in, and so we've had people, David and others, who've worked on grant proposals to get money from a variety of small foundations. Preservation Society of Asheville and Buncombe County gave us a grant so that we could apply for National Historic Register designation. And so there's a lot that we've done intentionally, but you also need to make sure that you're taking advantage of the accidental things that fall into your lap. Every single person who emails us through the website, we want to reach out to them and make sure they're included in invitations for community work days and other events. Just taking advantage of every single person who is interested, and there are amazing people who just appear to us, and embracing them and making them part of the family is very important as well. Yeah. So I want to thank our panelists, and we have another panel that's going to talk a little bit about the future. So I'll turn it back over to Adrian.
Absolutely. And I thank you for those who are leaving us questions in the chat. And also, I do see that someone has their hand raised. We will have a question and answer session as we get towards the close of this presentation. So if you want to leave it in the chat or just hold on to it until that time period, we would very much appreciate it. And at this point in time, yes, we are making a little bit of a transition into our next set of presenters here. And we are joined by a few very special guests. Angela, are you able to?
Yeah. Greetings, everyone. Well, so grateful for the rich conversations that we've heard today. I'll note that you'll see that today is about highlighting some of the doers. Many of us who are gathered here today in this virtual space understand that this is big work, this is deep work, and I want to call out that there are many people all over the state of North Carolina, and frankly, all over the country doing this work. And so again, this is highlighting one such group, but I'll call out some other folks that I see gathered with us today. I've got some folks from the Friends of Geer Cemetery on that I've noted, some folks from the Friends of Overland Village, I think some folks from John N. Smith Cemetery in Southport, North Carolina. If you are representing a cemetery or a cemetery friends group, please drop your group in the chat, because another goal of this gathering is to connect people. Let's connect doers to doers so that we can combine our resources to do this work better. So I don't see a rush in the chat. Okay, there we go, Town of Princeville. Wonderful. Again, hope to see some more doers drop themselves in the chat. I want to say that from Mr. Gibson's conversation or recollections, one of the most moving things that I pulled from it was this concept of evolution. Mr. Gibson was clear that folks came before him and that folks will come after him to do this work. And with this in mind, I am so honored to introduce one of our young people who is leading the charge to preserve African American cemeteries in North Carolina, Damasi Brown Gorham. Damasi, you have roots, or at the very least, part of your identity or your personhood is tied to Western North Carolina, which is another reason that we asked you to join us here today, again, for that geographic connection. But you, frankly, are part of this massive legacy, and you're carrying the torch of cultural preservation, and again, specifically Black cemetery preservation. So we want to hear from you a little bit about yourself and what you think the future of Black cemetery preservation work in North Carolina can look like, based specifically on your experience. So the floor is yours, Damasi. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Angela, for that introduction. In order to further introduce myself, I did go to Western Carolina University. I grew up in Kinston, North Carolina, so I saw Taylor Cemetery in Snow Hill down there. I actually grew up in Hugo, right across the line from Snow Hill, and never knew that that was there. So that just goes back to what they were talking about earlier. Pat, what she said specifically, like she grew up in that church and that community and never knew that those places were there, those sacred spaces were there. And that's something that I've heard time and time again, is that people are living in these communities, they don't know that there's something there worth saving. And so part of me being the Charles Jordan intern in 2019 was to raise awareness about those sacred spaces, to also gather the stories about those spaces. So I've actually visited, I think it's John C. Smith in Southport, and Greer and Evergreen in Richmond. And so I hold them in very high esteem for the way that they have formed themselves and formed this this educational piece to what they do. And that, I think that's very important, because you have to make it relevant for young people. Dwayne was talking about making sure that the young people know that this is sacred, and getting them out there. And a big part of what he said was about monetization. And I think that people, sometimes we think about this as needing to be voluntary, and it does at a certain level, but that monetization piece brings in the eyes from other places, you know, people with money, people with grant funding, you know, and they can see that it's profitable, and that brings in a lot of interest as well. So I think everybody here so far has said a lot to get us moving forward here.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Damasi. I also want to ask you, what are the possibilities, right? We at the African American Heritage Commission think a lot around the gaps, right? The tough stuff, the fact that this work is hard and seems endless, but in talking and connecting to someone like you, you bring me great hope around, again, the possibilities for the future of this work. So what is your hope as a youth, and what do you see as some of the possibilities?
My hope, especially first, is that when people think about how to give back to their community and activism, that they will incorporate sacred spaces into that thought process. Especially the African American Burial Grounds Networking Act can be very, very beneficial to the work that we're doing. I saw somebody asked about that earlier. The sharing of educational resources, the sharing of funds for the upkeep, the sharing of influence. All of that can be very beneficial. I also think that on the state level, there needs to be some sort of, I wouldn't say coalition, but some sort of grouping, a centralized educational body or something of that nature to get this information out on best practices, to get the information out on grants and how to apply them to your cemeteries, because competition is not bad in this realm. Competition can help us grow, and I think that that's very important, that people need to think about that when they're talking about saving cemeteries.
Thank you. The last question that I have for you today is one that I hope will make folks on this video chat smile. The last cemetery workshop that we had in the spring, I noticed that you had your classroom present, right? So you are on the ground is what, a third grade world history. Well, what is it?
It was ninth.
A ninth grade world history?
Yeah, high school.
Yes, so Demasi's on the ground is a ninth grade world history instructor connecting other young people to this work, exposing young people to the world of African American cemeteries and burial grounds. And so why is that important for you as a young person yourself who's deeply connected to these Gen Zers who will have a future role in preserving these sacred spaces?
I think, well, the class that you didn't get to see is actually my civil rights class. It ended just before that. So I'm also the civil rights teacher for North Monroe High School. I think the biggest thing about them is that they're looking for purpose, every single one of them. And finding a way to connect them to their own communities. I found that to be the part where they started listening and tuning in a lot more. Talking about the walkouts at Ken High School, talking about the musical greats, Maceo Parker, that's come from that community, talking about the past in Kinston, talking about the past in North Carolina. They get really connected. And so I think that with more research about the spaces in North Carolina that need help where cemeteries are concerned, I think getting that information out to kids, like Pat was talking about, getting them interested, that they're up for it. They really are. And so we just got to make sure that we're putting that in front of them as a choice. Days of service, making sure that you take those opportunities for days of service is very important.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for your time today, your brilliant insights, and again, the fact that you're joining us from out of state because you're not in North Carolina today. Where are you?
Wisconsin now.
You're in Wisconsin today. Okay.
Yeah, I'm in Wisconsin, don't you know?
Last week he was in a different state, everybody. So
Illinois, yeah.
Really, really grateful again that you are joining us and again able to share your insights. And I'm going to transition to Melissa Timo for some further insights. Melissa is the historic cemetery specialist for the North Carolina Office of State Archaeology. And so again, that is a state employee who is designated to helping us do the work of cemetery preservation. And she has been an incredible partner to the North Carolina African American Heritage Commission in our communities. And she's going to offer some insights into resources and things that we can do, again, to make this work stronger. So Melissa, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yes, this is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. Was able to get a job doing it 2 years ago with the state of North Carolina, so that's super exciting. Not all states have a cemetery specialist, so I was very happy to stumble upon this job because there is a need beyond just the data processing aspect of my job and the sort of navigating the laws. It's connecting communities with resources and helping communities navigate sort of the muddy waters that can come with cemeteries. Because some of these questions that pop up are sort of tricky. And so I am here to act as a resource or to help connect people. I'm gonna show you some images, if I can get this up. So what I'm going to be covering today, if I can make it work. There we go, is a little bit about where our partnership, the African American Heritage Commission and the NC Office of State Archaeology, which I will be calling OSA from here on out because that's really, really long. We came together to create a new sort of program to address some issues. We know of some cemeteries that are obvious and they're in our community. They may be as next to important resources like a school you can see at the Olive Hill Cemetery down there in Morganton, North Carolina and Burke County. But that's not always the case. What I hear from a lot of people are these cemeteries that are family cemeteries, cemeteries that have been associated with enslaved communities that are sort of tucked off behind places. The community may know, I joke that everybody's auntie knows where the cemetery is, but the whole community, as we've heard today, may not know it's even in their own backyard. So we see things where development happens, where somebody buys a piece of property and then there's I like to call them surprise cemeteries right behind them, and they don't know what to do with them. And so we come into this interesting situation where there's a community that knows, there's a community that doesn't know, and then a government body that's trying to figure out the best way to go about this. So we developed this African American Cemetery project in North Carolina to work to address all the ends. Part of it is sort of to address these issues about these places that are sort of hidden away, that DOT stumbles upon, or that a solar farm just stumbles upon, and what needs to happen. And so we also want to make sure that the communities are supported as well. And we do this a number of ways. We do this through resources, providing handouts and quick reads to get through rough patches, help develop sort of long-term managerial, cemetery management plans, help direct people towards figuring out how to do interpretive strategies to bring in people into their place to share their story, take their story into the community, as well as making sure that the cemeteries are recorded and known on a state level, so the likelihood of them being impacted in the future decreases. There's always going to be some troublesome issues that pop up with development, but our goal is to make sure that cemeteries are identified and recognized and supported as best as we can. Also, especially dealing with communities like African American communities that aren't sort of what fits as people's idea of what a cemetery should look like. That doesn't actually mean anything, because cemeteries come in a wide variety of shapes and sizes and designs. But especially some communities like African American communities and Native American communities, there are lots of beautiful cultural expressions that exist that aren't represented anywhere else, but can be overlooked as something completely different. Things like using artifacts or wooden markers that, like you see on the screen in these historic images, that may actually survive up into the 21st century and may look like garbage or trash, but actually have deep, really important and beautiful cultural ties to sometimes not just the immediate ancestors, but all the way back over to home traditions in Africa. So it's really important to help people understand a cemetery beyond just headstones, because oftentimes cemeteries aren't just headstones. They're not just the interments. There's more of a cultural community story in place. So we're offering a series of workshops. This is one of them, to help people think about cemeteries in a new way and figure out how to connect with them and sort of take their stories to another level. We were just in the beginning of talking about these things when we got our first opportunity to sort of make this real and make this play out. And that was when the office of Congresswoman Alma Adams approached us and asking for some sort of public event, because she is one of the co-authors, as you've seen in the chat if you're paying attention, of the original African American Burial Ground Network Act. And this was an act that was designed to help foster and support African American burial grounds in the United States. Now, its current status is sort of in limbo. It made through a number of successful hoops, but sort of stalled at the final line. So they're in the process of retooling it and repackaging it to present it again. So we're hoping that that will go through, and we're going to do what we can to make North Carolina a united state of cemetery groups working together to prove that something like this is a valuable and worthwhile endeavor. We want to be on the front line because there was originally intended to be some money for the study and preservation of cemeteries built into it. And we want to make sure from the state level down that we get our state cemeteries ready to potentially tap into this federal level resource. So we partnered with her office in the Biddlesville area of Charlotte, which is a traditionally African American neighborhood. We hosted a workshop where we had a whole bunch of plans, but we ended up listening to the questions that the community was actually asking. And what they wanted to know the most about was, for their particular community, advocacy. What are the laws surrounding cemeteries in North Carolina? How do we have the right to visit these places when they aren't on property that our family owns anymore? So that's, and then we had a nice, lovely plan set out, but by listening to the workshop, to the folks who were attending the workshop, we got a much better workshop out of it. And so that became our strategy, is to approach communities and say, what is your problem? What are you struggling with your historic cemeteries? Because everywhere is different. No two cemeteries are the same, but sometimes there are regional concerns. And so that we've moved forward. So we did this workshop. We had 75 people attended. It was great. We also went to an associated cemetery, or a cemetery that's just down the street, to talk about things that you could do inside the cemetery for care. But really, the most of the time, and that spilled over, was about advocacy. We did a workshop with Elizabeth City, and that was partnered with Elizabeth City State University. So we were talking a lot about practical elements so that we could get their students involved. And how would a student take on a cemetery? What I find with cemeteries is the issue is never passion. There's always passion when associated with a cemetery project. It's the nuts and bolts that people stumble on and that help things fizz out. So we're looking to make some of those things easier. And so one of the big things that I tell people is the first thing that you need to do if you're looking for historic preservation, even if you don't have people to help you weed whack and mow, is to make sure your cemetery is recorded on all levels, especially the state. And we have a citizen cemetery reporting form that is pretty easy and pretty basic to fill out. And this will allow us on a state level to put a red flag on the map where your cemetery is, so that even if your efforts fizzle or stall for a little while, somebody always knows where your cemetery is. And that is really important in a lot of cases. Even if it's just in 10 years, if your kid or your niece or nephew or somebody else wants to take up the mantle, they'll already see what's already been done because we have a record of it. So that's one thing that I always encourage people to do. And you can visit our website to find that form, download it, send it to me, and I will get it on the map. But also, especially with workshops like this, we're going to provide folks with a list of resources that are professionals or places that you can reach out to for help. So this workshop, if you've signed up for it, obviously you're here, you'll also get a copy of all of these things. So don't worry about having to write these all down. You'll get a nice PDF with all of these web addresses sent to you. So I've broken these down into, these are sort of Western North Carolina and North Carolina specific, but I've also, some of these things will be useful or trigger maybe folks to think of places in their own communities across the states or wherever you are about new places to look for help or to look for information. There are a number of different libraries, preservation societies, research organizations that exist. And just because you are not a student there or don't belong, like you're not a faculty or staff member there, does not mean that you are not allowed to use these resources. They're not shut off to you. We have things like things that are in person, like the Pack Memorial Library or UNCA library, but also there are online resources. North Carolina has sort of a coalition of library resources. It's on their NC Live, and they have lots of things that are tied into genealogical and historical research, old maps, that sort of thing that you can visit. And you don't even need to go to their places. I don't know how many libraries are fully operational these days anyway. Also, there is historical associations, the Old Buncombe County Genealogical Society. All of these places can help move you towards more knowledge about your location, especially if it's not associated with your own family, but also may connect you to other people who are doing the same sorts of research. We have a ton of resources under African American Heritage Commission, my office, Office of State Archaeology, the Historic Preservation Office, and the State Archives. Tons of research. In 1938, the Works Progress Administration did a cemetery survey. And so some information may be available about a cemetery that you're studying through the old WPA records. They don't have pictures, or sometimes the description of the locations are kind of suspect. 1938 is North Carolina is much different than 2021 North Carolina, but they may help you connect to names or maybe even an old name for the cemetery that you weren't familiar with. Asheville is also home to the Western office of our sort of departments, the Western Regional Archives. They have archaeological, archival, and historical staff that are very happy to help you with your more local research requests. I have the address for the African American Heritage Commission, the OSA. The Historic Preservation Office is another office that deals a lot with standing structures, but they are a great resource if you're looking for help with National Register nominations, which is a complicated process, sometimes takes years. They've got the staff in place to help navigate you through that. There's also a bunch of cultural and community connections right in your own backyard that you can reach out not only for help understanding a cemetery, but also may have folks that can come out and help you do your work. Hood Huggers, I made sure to, in South Asheville, to make sure to include those. YMI is a local African American Heritage center. Word on the Street does a lot with youth art, which is a fantastic thing that we're seeing in new efforts across the country to memorialize African American cemeteries in a new way. Like I said earlier, cemeteries don't have to be anything. You can remember your community in a way that's significant to you. And I don't want people to be afraid of doing that. It makes it more impactful for future generations that they can connect to it more easily. Also, one of the big things that I even saw in the chats was, okay, there's these pots of money that might be available. There might be, maybe we want to become a nonprofit to do this or that. How do we even do this? because they can be very complicated. Sometimes, depending on the grant you're going after, they can be very competitive or may not feel like they could be a good fit, but could if you can massage the language in the right way. This is not everyone's, falls within their realm of experience. It's not something that they're do on their day-to-day basis. So I wanted to make sure that I include some local resources that might help you pursue these, even if you don't have someone amongst your volunteers or your staff that can do that. Small business centers are fantastic for hosting lots of different workshops. They can be nonprofit workshops, they can be grant-related workshops. So always check your local small business center's community calendar to see what kind of events that are happening. And sometimes they're really cheap. You can do a whole class for 20 bucks. So they're definitely worth checking out. Also, the Asheville Buncombe Technical Community College offers a grant writing course. And because it's through a community college, you don't have to worry about it being an exorbitant price as well. Because I know that's something that's, especially for folks that are doing it on a volunteer basis, money is always going to be an issue. So look at your community colleges. They often have a lot of great resources that are in demand. And if you aren't seeing it, ask them, is this something that you're willing to host through your community college? I also have two sources there for if you're considering taking a step, your volunteers up a step to create a nonprofit, which is also often a complicated process. There's a North Carolina Center for Nonprofits that has lots of different resources and connections, and I think they even have some mentorship programs that you can look into there, as well as this company, Funding for Good. They operate out of North Carolina, but I chose them because they have lots of free things to help you sort of put your thoughts and your dreams into a spreadsheet so that you can apply for grants more effectively. Because sometimes we have a goal, but how do we phrase a goal in a concrete way so that people hand us money? And that's very difficult for even me to wrap my head around. I don't love the idea of commodifying resources, but sometimes that needs to happen in order for them to survive and proliferate through your community. So these will be on your worksheet as well. Also, you can always reach out to myself or the African American Heritage Commission if you have questions or would like some technical assistance or direction to find somebody in your local area. That's what we're here for, is to help usher you through. My contact is on the top left there. Definitely email me or call me. African American Heritage Commission is down below. And then I know my office is on Facebook and Instagram, and you can also find our websites where you can find connections to resources. We're soon to have an African American Cemetery Project webpage up that we will have videos and resources and forms and things available for the public to access at any point. Stop sharing.
Thank you, Melissa. Adrian, should I turn it back over to you?
Yeah, absolutely. You certainly can. Thank you, Melissa, for that very thorough overview. And for those who aren't keeping an eye in the chat, she has created a list of resources that you saw there in the presentation that we will be emailing out to each and every one of you along with this webinar recording. So you can certainly take a look at that and feel free to share with your contacts who might find this information valuable. I do want to be cognizant that we are just a little bit over time. And I have not seen any additional questions in the chat. So if you do have any or you think of one later, much of our contact information has already been shared. Melissa has her email address listed, as well as the North Carolina African American Heritage Commission's website email address has been shared in the chat as well. I do want to thank you all for joining us. I do want to thank everyone who participated as a panelist this evening. We are so incredibly thankful for you sharing your wealth of information from your personal experiences in your communities. I think if we've learned anything this evening, it's the continuation of this. It takes a village. It takes, looking for individuals, looking for folks who are willing to be invested in your community. And it might not even be who you expect. There are friends and neighbors who are interested in sharing and preserving this great and significant history. So I do hope that you all have a wonderful rest of your evening. And thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good night. Bye.